Congress of the United States, having in view the important interests of our commerce embarked in the whale fisheries and other adventures in the great Southern Ocean, by an act of the 18th of May, 1836, authorized an expedition to be fitted out for the purpose of exploring and surveying that sea. Charles Wilkes, commander of the expedition, to the Navy Department, August 11, 1838. Thus began the great United States exploring expedition of 1838 to 1842, of which few have ever heard or even today fully understand. An expedition fraught with danger, marred with controversy and intrigue, led by a harsh, inexperienced commander and ending in multiple courts-martial. An expedition that nevertheless achieved results undreamt of at the time, surpassing the famed Lewis and Clark expedition with its discoveries and collections. As many as 280 islands were explored, some mapped and charted to an accuracy used 100 years later in the U.S. Pacific campaigns of World War II. 800 miles of the U.S. Oregon and Washington coasts were mapped, along with 100 miles of the Columbia River. Proof of Antarctica as a continent was established, along with the mapping of 1,500 miles of coastline. 60,000 plant and bird specimens were collected, of which thousands were newly discovered species. The exploring expedition became the foundation of the famed Smithsonian Institute, today the world's largest museum and research complex. Much has been written and spoken regarding the shortcomings and failures of the U.S. exploring expedition. But in historic hindsight, the expedition was a resounding exploration and scientific success. As early as 1828, the House of Representatives passed a resolution requesting then-President John Quincy Adams to send at least one ship to explore the Pacific Ocean region of the world. The resolution was inspired by the efforts of Jeremiah Reynolds, a newspaper editor, explorer, and author of the story Mocha Dick, a story of a real Pacific Ocean white sperm whale, and inspiration for the later 1851 book Moby Dick. This renowned monster, who had come off victorious in 100 fights with his pursuers, was an old bull whale of prodigious size and strength. Jeremiah Reynolds. It was not until 1837, under the direction of the newly elected President Martin Van Buren, that the expedition moved forward. Originally, the expedition was to be led by Commodore Thomas Jones, but upon his resignation in 1837, the command was assigned to U.S. Navy Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. Wilkes was not a senior officer, but did have a reputation in the sciences of hydrography, geodesy, and magnetism, as well as mathematics and triangulation, essential to plotting maps and navigation charts. The voyage was an expedition of exploration, so it included a scientific corps of naturalists, botanists, mineralogists, geologists, and language experts. Wilkes himself took over much of the science, including the physical and nautical sciences, surveying, astronomy, and meteorology. The expedition also included engravers and illustrators, whose job was to accurately record the voyage and its discoveries. All told, the expedition consisted of nearly 400 men. The complement of crew, scientists, and equipment would sail aboard a small, somewhat ragtag fleet of ships that included the USS Vincennes, the largest ship in the fleet at 780 tons, with 18 guns for defense. The Vincennes was an experienced sloop of war that had already sailed around the world twice before the U.S. exploring expedition, and is credited with being the first U.S. Navy ship to do so. The USS Peacock at 650 tons and 22 guns. The Peacock served as a warship in the War of 1812, where she was credited with capturing 20 ships during various battles around the world, as well as rooting out pirates in the Caribbean. The USS Relief at 468 tons and 7 guns. The Relief was commissioned as a supply ship in 1836, with her first assignment to the exploring expedition. The USS Porpoise at 230 tons and 10 guns. The Porpoise was used for coastal surveying operations by expedition leader Charles Wilkes prior to the launch of the exploring expedition. The USS Seagull at 110 tons and 2 guns. The Seagull was a former New York Harbor pilot boat and purchased specifically for the exploring expedition. And finally, the USS Flying Fish at 96 tons and 2 guns, another former New York pilot boat. On August 18, 1838, the expedition set out from Norfolk, Virginia, and headed east on the Atlantic Ocean. On or about September 10, 1838, Wilkes reported that they viewed the Peak of Pico, a nearly 8,000-foot mountain in the Azores Island group. They then passed St. Michael's Island as they headed towards Madeira Island. On September 16th, the expedition reached their first planned stop at the island of Madeira, off the northwest coast of Africa. The expedition anchored in the Bay of Funchal, and then explored and recorded the sights of the island, such as Astroza Pass, the Heath Forest, and production of the famed Madeira wines. On September 25, 1838, the expedition left Madeira and headed south, stopping at Cape de Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. As these islands were well known, Wilkes wrote only basic observation of the stop. However, Wilkes did take note of the slow sailing of the supply ship Relief, hinting that its slow speed may not be entirely due to its design. Although something is undoubtedly due to her dull sailing, yet the difference is too great to be entirely attributed to that cause. During the courts-martial that followed the completion of the expedition, Wilkes was reported to have accused the officers and crew of just such poor performance hinted at in his narrative. On October 7th, the expedition set sail for Rio de Janeiro, recording many observations of the sea, currents, weather, and stars along the way. On or about November 23, 1838, Wilkes reported that the expedition first sighted the mountains around Rio de Janeiro, often referred to as San Salvador in the narrative. At this point, Wilkes made note of the extensive ship repairs required, especially of the Peacock, and reports that the original outfitting of the Peacock appeared to be fraudulent. The defects about the vessel were so glaring that in going to the high latitudes, it would have been impossible to have secured the crew from great suffering and exposure. Wilkes noted again of the slow passage of the Relief and sent the Relief on before the rest of the expedition, hoping the early start would allow it to arrive at the next stop on time. On January 6, 1839, the expedition weighed anchor and left Rio de Janeiro. As the expedition voyaged further south, they would encounter more and more bad weather. On or about February 16th, the expedition sailed past, and within about 2 miles, of Cape Horn. At this point, the expedition had passed below the southernmost point of South America and the Western Hemisphere. On February 17th, the expedition arrived at Orange Harbor, a protected inlet just northwest of Cape Horn. It is at this point in the voyage that new science and new dangers would be forthcoming to the expedition. Immediately on our arrival at Orange Harbor, active preparations were made for a short cruise to the Antarctic. Although the season was late, I at least anticipated getting some experience among the ice. But all was not well with the expedition, as Wilkes alludes to in his narrative. Various causes conspired to render our short stay in Orange Harbor the turning point of the discipline of the crews, that any officer could have so far lost sight of their duty, or would allow selfish feelings to predominate over those of the public good. My prompt and energetic action soon put an end to these small difficulties. It can be argued that the narrative, written from Wilkes' perspective, put Wilkes in the best light. Nevertheless, even Wilkes records his own actions that will later lead to his court-martial trial. On February 25th, the Porpoise, with Wilkes himself on board, and the Seagull, departed from Orange Harbor and headed south. On March 1st, Wilkes records that the first icebergs were spotted. Shortly afterward, they spotted Ridley's Island and then King George's Island of the South Shetland Islands. On March 2nd, the ships were enveloped in thick fog, making navigation impossible and creating treacherous sailing conditions with icebergs in the waters around them. Wilkes also reported a strong sulfurous smell. Volcanic activity was known then and today to exist in the area he was sailing. March 3rd dawned with clear skies and the two ships continued south. By now they were surrounded by icebergs and could go no further. Wilkes also realized their situation was critical and they must get out of the ice by nightfall. They cleared the ice field, but were then enclosed by fog until the next morning, at which time a strong gale storm set in. The low temperatures caused ice and snow to accumulate on the decks of the two small ships. Wilkes writes of their perilous situation in the matter-of-fact tone of a scientist, but the two ships were in extreme danger as the storm got worse and more ice accumulated on the rigging and decks. Wilkes finally aborted their efforts and turned north. He ordered the Seagull to return to Orange Harbor. Wilkes tried to sail the Porpoise to some other nearby islands to conduct more research, but writes of a crew enfeebled by exposure and scurvy, as well as the continued need to escape from close encounters with ice. On March 7th, Wilkes found they were 50 miles off their expected course and their ship nearly wrecked upon a small island that loomed up in yet another fog bank. The continued storm set them off yet another 30 miles, but they finally made anchor at Good Success Bay. While making a landing on the shore, the waves overturned one of the rowboats and nearly killed several men. Wilkes credits their life preservers with saving their lives. In an instant, the boat was thrown over and they found themselves struggling for life in the furious surf. The storms continued, and with the men still ashore, the Porpoise went to sea to ride out the storm. It was not until 4 days later that the Porpoise could return to Good Success Bay and pick up the stranded men. Finally, on March 30th, Wilkes and the Porpoise reached Orange Harbor, where the rest of the expedition was safe. The expedition stayed at Orange Harbor and conducted research in the area. After setting sail on or about April 20th, the expedition left for Valparaiso, Chile. However, at this time, the whereabouts of the ship Relief was unknown. The expedition arrived in Valparaiso May 15, 1839, where they were relieved to find that the ship Relief had sailed on ahead to Peru. For the most part, the stay in Valparaiso and the explorations inland were routine. However, disaster struck the expedition when it was concluded that the schooner Seagull, last seen at midnight April 28, 1839, was lost at sea with all hands. It was presumed that she was lost in storms that hit April 29th on the way to Valparaiso. A search was made for her, but no trace was found. Wilkes makes quick note of the loss in his narrative. A monument to the Seagull still stands in the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On June 6th of 1839, the expedition left Valparaiso, Chile, and headed toward Callao, Peru, arriving June 20th. Shortly after their arrival in Callao, Wilkes wrote of having to deal with 3 deserters and a drunken riot by a crew who stole and consumed a store of liquor. Wilkes wrote that these were court-martial offenses deserving of 12 lashes. However, Wilkes dispensed with the courts-martial and ordered a harsher punishment of 24 lashes for the rioters, with 36 and 41 lashes for the deserters. Wilkes' decision to bypass the trials and inflict excessive punishments would come back to haunt him in his own court-martial years later. On July 13, 1839, the expedition set sail from the South American continent. The store ship Relief, considered useless by now, was sent home by way of the Sandwich Islands, Australia, and back around Cape Horn. She was to conduct whatever research possible along the way. A month later, the expedition made their first landfall at Clermont-de-Tonnerre, or the modern-day Rayo in French Polynesia. Wilkes surveyed the island and then made an attempt to land on the beach, but was driven back by the hostile natives. Wilkes blamed his native New Zealand interpreter, John Sack, for the hostility. I am rather inclined now to think that our interpreter was partly the cause. John Sack was truly a savage. He was a petty New Zealand chief, half-naked, brandishing his boat hook like a spear. As we could not understand him, he may have said many things to irritate the savage chief. After driving off the natives with warning shots from their firearms, Wilkes made a quick landing, returning to his ships when the natives began regrouping. On September 10, 1839, the expedition arrived at Tahiti Island, anchoring in Matavai Bay. Most of Wilkes' narrative while in Tahiti describes the island geography and his work at surveying the land. Wilkes does devote several paragraphs to the moral standards of the people. Licentiousness does still exist among them, but the foreign residents and visitors are in a great degree the cause of its continuance. I have particular reference to the crews of foreign ships in making brothels of their ships. While visiting the nearby island of Amio, 3 crewmen deserted from the Vincennes. All 3 were hunted down with the help of the local natives. No mention is made of their punishment. On September 29th, the expedition departed from Tahiti. Wilkes and the Vincennes next arrived at the small island of Tutuila in the Samoan group and anchored in Pago Pago Harbor. Wilkes found the natives pleasant and nothing like their reputation derived from the reports of an attack on an earlier French expedition. Wilkes spends many pages of his narrative on the efforts of the Western missionaries and of the natives' singular regret. The people look back on the days when polygamy existed with regret, and cannot understand why they are restricted to one wife. When leaving, the Vincennes weighed anchor to sail out of Pago Pago Harbor, however the ship nearly wrecked upon the reefs. The almost constant southeast wind is ahead on going out, which renders egress difficult. The wind was light and it failed altogether just as we reached the most dangerous part of the channel. We were brought within an oar's length of the reef, on which a heavy surf was breaking. I breathed more freely after the crisis had passed. On November 10, 1839, the expedition set sail for Port Jackson, or the modern Sydney Harbour, New South Wales, Australia, arriving November 29th. Wilkes noted that the crew was excited to be once more in a civilized country, and they received a cordial welcome. Wilkes wrote about Australia in the typical observation report style of his narrative. Wilkes wrote extensively of the local natives, of whom he seems to have little regard, except for the boomerang. The most extraordinary weapon is the boomerang. At first sight, one would conclude it was a wooden sword. In the hands of a native it is a missile, and it is made to describe some most extraordinary curves and movements. By December 18th of 1839, Wilkes wrote that the expedition had completed its observations of Australia and was ready to set sail for Antarctica. He then describes the observations of visitors aboard his expedition ships. All seemed disappointed at not being able to see the same complete outfits in our vessels as those of the Ross expedition. Most of our visitors considered us to be doomed to be frozen to death. Furthermore, Wilkes wrote that the Peacock was in poor condition and that the whole of her upper works were rotten. The vessel was quietly examined, and her state was found even worse than represented. Yet Wilkes did not repair the boat, as it would have delayed the exploration of Antarctica. He did, however, note that he felt anxious for the crew during the cruise. On December 26th, the expedition set sail from Sydney for Antarctica. It was discovered shortly after leaving the harbor that there were 2 stowaways aboard. Apparently 2 Australian convicts had climbed aboard. Wilkes vowed to return them upon his return to Australia. On January 10th, they encountered their first iceberg, and by the next day the icebergs were thick enough to impede their course. By that evening, the ice stopped them altogether. They proceeded west along the ice barrier, their vision frequently blocked by thick fog and nearly hitting the ice with their ships. Wilkes only hinted at the great danger in which they sailed. On January 16th, after several suspected sightings of land, the Vincennes, Peacock, and Porpoise all confirmed the sighting of land. At this time, they suspected they had found a large island. Wilkes continued pushing south and ran into more ice and fog, putting the ship in great danger. The feeling is awful, and the uncertainty most trying thus to enter within the ice barrier blindfolded, as it were by an impenetrable fog, and the thought constantly reoccurring that both ship and crew were in imminent danger. The 3 ships continued on, periodically sighting each other as they probed the ice fields. multiple times each recorded seeing and charting land. Meanwhile, on January 23rd, while exploring a bay, the Peacock, attempting to avoid hitting ice in the front of the boat, crashed her rear stern into the ice behind and bent the rudder, rendering it useless. The crew attempted to slow and steer the ship by anchoring to the ice, but this failed and the stern crashed into a wall of ice, splintering what was left of the rudder. The Peacock was trapped, with ice pressing in all around and bad weather was on the horizon. She continued to drift and again crashed into the ice wall, causing extensive damage to the side and deck edges. But that time the Peacock bounced off the ice wall, twisting her such that the sails caught the wind and carried her into a clearing. Moments later, a wall of ice sheared off the cliff and crashed into the sea where the Peacock had just stood moments before. Though taking on water and still crashing into ice, the crew was able to eventually maneuver the ship to open water. Upon examining the ship, the crew found that they had come very close to a cold and icy grave. For 24 hours, the carpenters worked to fashion a working rudder, and the ship set sail on or about January 26th to Sydney for repairs. Meanwhile, Vincennes and Porpoise continued on, probing the ice and spotting even more land. Wilkes reported of difficulty maneuvering within all of the large icebergs and was again plagued by fog and storms. The sea spray now froze so quickly to the rigging and deck that just managing the sails was becoming nearly impossible. At one point, the Vincennes had to thread the needle between two large icebergs, narrowly escaping being crushed between them. The weather finally cleared, and the Vincennes again sailed into the ice and came within a half-mile of a rocky shore with the land behind rising to 3,000 feet. Some thought they saw a smoking volcano. It is at this point in the narrative that Wilkes refers to the region as the Antarctic continent, now convinced it is a true continent and not a collection of icebound islands. February 14, 1840 dawned clear, and Wilkes noted that they could see 75 miles of land coastline, but could still not make a landing due to the ice. However, Wilkes did land a party on a large iceberg and collected stone, gravel, and mud samples found embedded in the ice, as well as 500 gallons of delicious water. On February 21st, Wilkes determined that the Vincennes had completed its work in Antarctica and would head north to their next port. He gathered the men, thanked them for their hard work, and then cut their water rations in half. During the Vincennes adventure, the Porpoise also explored the region on its own. It dealt with the same storms and perilous ice. The report from the Porpoise parallels that of the Vincennes, and she turned north on February 24th. In addition to the three ships, the smaller Flying Fish also worked to penetrate the ice. However, being a much smaller vessel, it did not fare well in the heavy weather. By February 5th, the crew petitioned Lieutenant Pinckney, commander of the tender, to head north as they were in a most deplorable condition. Pinckney agreed, and they headed north. It would be difficult to underestimate the importance of the nearly 3 months of exploration of Antarctica. This exploration was credited with determining that Antarctica was a new continent rather than a collection of islands surrounded by ice. Just as important, the crews provided the most accurate maps and charts of 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline. In doing so, many place names were added that still remain, including the 1,500-mile stretch now known as Wilkes Land. On March 30th, the expedition gathered in New Zealand after a short stop back at Sydney, Australia. The expedition spent only until April 6th in New Zealand, with Wilkes remarking, "I believe that no person in the squadron felt any regret at leaving New Zealand, for there was a want of all means of amusement, as well as of any objects in whose observations we were interested." By April 23rd, the expedition arrived at the island of Tonga Tabou, or modern-day Tonga Tapu of the Kingdom of Tonga. Wilkes records the common observations of the people, most notable that the people were absolutely passionate about smoking tobacco, as well as meeting King George, who had previously united the islands into a kingdom. On May 4, 1840, the expedition left Tonga and headed for Fiji, arriving on the 8th. However, the flying fish was nowhere to be seen. Fiji was known to be a warrior and cannibalistic culture, so Wilkes armed his men during their surveying and scientific duties. Several days later, the flying fish arrived. She had grounded on a reef and was nearly lost. On July 12th, Wilkes received a report that the natives at Suilib Bay on the island of Vanua Levu had attacked and captured an expedition cutter boat. Shots were exchanged and the expedition crewmen escaped to a second small launch. The natives took possession of the cutter and stripped her clean. Wilkes launched an attack and burned 2 native villages. The heated bamboo canes exploded like gunfire, and it was thought a gun battle had ensued. However, on July 24th, another attack occurred against the crew when they went to the island of Malalo to bargain for food. Expedition crewman Lieutenant Underwood and Wilkes' own nephew, Midshipman Wilkes Henry, were killed in the fighting. The following day, Wilkes ordered an attack upon the natives. 60 to 100 expedition sailors landed and attacked. An estimated 80 Fijians were killed and 2 more villages burned. 1 expedition sailor was wounded. These battles were the first U.S. military conflicts in the South Pacific. Upon returning to the United States, both battles resulted in charges against Wilkes at his court-martial. On September 24th, the expedition anchored in Honolulu Harbor, Sandwich Islands, or the modern Hawaiian Islands. Wilkes and his officers met King Kamehameha III and other dignitaries. On December 2nd, the Peacock and Flying Fish departed for the South Pacific to look for suspected islands and resurvey islands which Wilkes thought were originally poorly surveyed. The expedition then moved forward with surveying the Hawaiian Islands and on December 9, 1840, sailed into Hilo Bay, Hawaii. On December 14th, Wilkes and other members of the expedition, along with a number of porters, set out for the top of Kilauea to survey the Kilauea volcano. Wilkes described the Kilauea volcano as awe-inspiring, and even more so at night when the lava flows glow. A team walked and surveyed among the hot steaming lava, which Wilkes describes. A bluish smoke was seen issuing, smelling strongly of sulfur, and marked by a white, tasteless powder. It was difficult to detect without scalding the fingers. There were many cracks where our sticks were set on fire, and some places where the rocks might be seen red hot. Wilkes even descended into the crater itself. By modern standards, Wilkes and his team ventured into very dangerous conditions. John often repeated that there was no safety in the bottom of the crater for one moment, and that the fire would often run over 10 or more acres in a few moments. On December 18th, the expedition set off for Mauna Loa volcano. After a laborious climb in the thin air, the biting cold, and with a shortage of water for 300 thirsty people, Wilkes released from service the nearly naked and freezing native porters, who dumped the expedition supplies on the side of the mountain and ran. On or about December 22nd, the expedition reached the edge of the crater at the top of Mauna Loa. The team spent Christmas Day in a snowstorm, wrapped in blankets, with only enough firewood to heat a little chocolate. Soon after, they began building a camp in which the tents were surrounded by walls of stacked lava stones to keep out the freezing wind. Wilkes named it Pendulum Peak after the most cumbersome scientific instrument. The temperature regularly hovered in the teens and 20s. Water boiled 25 degrees below normal and static electricity sparkled everywhere. On January 12th, Wilkes and team hiked to the summit of Mauna Loa. The very idea of standing on the summit of one of the highest peaks in the midst of this vast ocean would have been exciting even to a strong man, but the sensation was overpowering to one already exhausted by breathing the rarefied air and toiling over the lava which this huge cauldron must have vomited forth to form a dome 60 miles in diameter and nearly 3 miles in height. That evening, Wilkes and several of his men suffered acute altitude sickness and snow blindness, and feared they would go blind that night. Fortunately, they did not go blind, and the next day the expedition broke camp after 3 weeks of observations. Wilkes and his team accomplished the first official scientific expedition to the Hawaiian volcanoes and established the correct heights of Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea. The remains of Camp Pendulum Peak are still visible today. The expedition spent another 2.5 months in Hawaii, exploring and documenting the islands, including the island of Maui with its volcano. On April 15, 1841, the expedition left Hawaii for the northwest coast of America and the survey of the Columbia River. On April 28, 1841, the expedition spotted Cape Disappointment in the Oregon Territories along the modern Washington state coast. Wilkes immediately tried to cross the treacherous Columbia River bar, but was held off by high waves stretching the length of the opening. Wilkes wrote of the bar, "All who have seen it have spoke of the wildness of the scene, and the incessant roaring of the waters, representing it as one of the most fearful sights that can possibly meet the eye of the sailor." Wilkes then thought better of crossing the bar at this time, and instead sailed north to begin the expedition surveys. For the next several weeks, the expedition explored the region and wrote of the natives, settlers, and major landmarks, such as Mount Rainier. Wilkes himself set out on a land journey to the Columbia River, noting the beauty of the land and a sad review of the natives' condition and high mortality rate. Wilkes reached the Columbia several days later and traveled by canoe to Astoria, which Wilkes found in dilapidated condition. From Astoria, Wilkes was able to see and assess the Columbia River bar, 4 miles wide, with views of Cape Disappointment across the river. Wilkes then traveled up the Columbia to Fort Vancouver, the regional headquarters of the powerful Hudson Bay Company in present-day Vancouver, Washington, where he observed, "Vancouver is a large manufacturing, agricultural, and commercial depot, and there are few, if any, idlers except the sick. Everybody seems to be in a hurry, whilst there appears to be no obvious reason for it." Wilkes also noted that most of the servants appeared to be held in a form of indentured servitude, never able to work their way out of debt from the company. From June 3rd, Wilkes and his overland party toured the region and made extensive notes of all they saw, including the rich salmon runs of the local rivers. On June 17th, Wilkes, on the Vincennes, set out to sea. He noted his anxiety regarding the now missing peacock and flying fish. Day after day had passed in the anxious expectation of receiving news of the peacock and flying fish, until a conviction became general that some serious accident had occurred among the dangerous coral reefs and islands they had been sent to explore. They were now 3 months. Wilkes had ordered the 2 ships to arrive at the Columbia River between May 15th and April 1st, 1841, but no later than April 1st. On July 27th, Wilkes received dispatches that confirmed that the peacock was lost, but on the bar of the Columbia, not coral reefs. It wasn't until August 6th that Captain Hudson of the Peacock arrived on board the Vincennes to update Wilkes of the loss. Wilkes wrote in his narratives that Captain Hudson attempted to sail over the bar at a point where there were no breaking waves and the water was smooth. However, the water was deceiving and the ship quickly struck ground. The sea conditions grew worse and the ship flooded and looked to break apart. However, the crew managed to stay the night aboard her. By morning, the tide had fallen and the sea calmed. A large canoe of Chinook Indians came alongside the Peacock and rendered assistance. With the Chinook's help and the Peacock's rowboats, most of the men and the expedition research made it safely to shore. Another effort was made to get the rest of the men off when a wave threw one of the rowboats end over end with her crew thrown into the water. Though injured, the waterlogged crew was rescued. A final attempt to rescue the remaining men succeeded, and all were safe. An attempt to return to the ship in the morning proved fruitless, as the Peacock was, by then, destroyed and scattered for many miles. There was nothing else to be done about the Peacock, so Wilkes transferred to the Porpoise and with the Flying Fish passed through the Columbia Bar to complete the survey of the Columbia River. Wilkes sent the Vincennes and land parties to San Francisco to survey the Sacramento River. He then purchased the brig Thomas H. Perkins, a ship similar to this image, to replace the Peacock and later renamed her the USS Oregon. By October 10th, all of the expedition boats had crossed the Columbia Bar and headed out to sea, bound for San Francisco. During the overland survey, the expedition passed Indian burial sites, the 14,000-foot active volcano of Mount Shasta, and into the Great Central Valley of California. The expedition survey of the Columbia River and Oregon region resulted in one of the most accurate maps of the Columbia and Willamette rivers, as well as set the stage for the United States to acquire the Oregon region as a new territory in 1848. On October 19, 1841, Wilkes arrived at San Francisco and met the Vincennes, which had already surveyed the Sacramento River. The Sacramento River and Overland Survey parties had also met Captain Sutter, who had just established a large 48,000-acre grant from the Mexican government along the Sacramento River. Sutter provided significant support to the expedition as they passed through his land. Sutter would later become known as the Sutter of Sutter's Mill, now synonymous with the famed California gold rush. Wilkes writes of the condition of the local Indians under the Mexican government. Whole tribes have been swept off by the smallpox, communicated by the Indians who have been discharged by the mission. All agree that the Indians have been very unjustly treated by the governor. The Spanish consider the Indians public property. The value of an Indian's life in the eye of the ruler scarcely exceeds that of one of the wild cattle. In Wilkes' desire to save time, the expedition departed San Francisco on November 1st, but at the end of a falling tide. Soon the tide changed to an incoming tide, and they were forced to anchor just outside the Golden Gate, with the Vincennes on the bar. The swells turned to large breakers as high as 30 feet, endangering the ship and crew. At one point, a huge breaker swept over the deck and drove a spar into a sailor, killing him. The tide finally turned, and they were able to sail out of danger. Although Wilkes plays down the dangers in his narrative, his haste in leaving San Francisco Bay under less than favorable conditions contributed directly to the sailor's death and the ship's damage. By November 18th, the expedition reached Honolulu again, staying 10 days to resupply and repair the battered and failing tender Flying Fish. On November 27, 1841, the expedition left Honolulu. The Porpoise and the Oregon sailed to explore the islands west of Hawaii, while Wilkes on the Vincennes and the Flying Fish sailed south to explore additional islands thought to exist. On January 13, 1842, Wilkes anchored in Manila Bay, Philippines. Although the expedition spent only a short time in Manila, Wilkes documented much of the culture and history of the islands, and the team collected numerous specimens. The expedition departed Manila on January 21st for Singapore. Wilkes on the Vincennes and the Flying Fish sailed in tandem through the Sulu Sea, conducting surveying jobs and establishing a treaty with the Sulu government to manage trade with the United States. The expedition arrived in Singapore on February 18, 1842, where they met the Porpoise and Oregon. The Flying Fish was found to be in such bad shape that she was sold for $3,700. The expedition left Singapore on February 26th for the final leg home to New York. The Vincennes made short stops in Cape Town, South Africa, and the island of St. Helena, where they visited Longwood House, the final residence of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Oregon and Porpoise went to Rio de Janeiro to make some observations and then proceeded to New York. Wilkes and the Vincennes arrived in New York June 10, 1842. The Oregon and Porpoise arrived a few days later. Wilkes wrote in the final paragraphs of his narrative a short defense in reference to the court-martial charges brought against him. Those who have pursued this full narrative of the events of the expedition, I confidently believe, will absolve me from all the charges so industriously circulated against me, relative to the manner in which I have conducted the expedition. I trust that the applause of a grateful country has been only delayed, not wholly lost. The scientific results of the expedition were astounding. 280 islands were surveyed, as well as the coast and inland waterways of the American Pacific Northwest, including the mighty Columbia River. The existence of Antarctica as a continent and not simply a collection of frozen islands was confirmed, although it would be years before Wilkes received his due credit for this accomplishment. Thousands of specimens were returned to the United States, and thousands of detailed drawings were made by the artists and scientists. These collections, images, and data became the foundation for the U.S. Smithsonian Institute, today the world's largest museum and research complex. Wilkes' narratives indicate that Wilkes himself was politically and socially forward-thinking. While he acknowledged the slaves held by many cultures, he also acknowledged their ill treatment and miserable conditions. Likewise, for the many indigenous peoples he came across, especially the ill treatment by settlers and the genocidal effect of disease on the Native Americans the expedition met and studied. In addition, Wilkes writes of the importance of the United States acquiring the Pacific Northwest, California, and Hawaii as territories. He even alludes to future statehood for each, decades before these events occurred. Despite the success of the voyage, Wilkes was excoriated by the expedition crew and staff, as well as on the floor of Congress. Wilkes was also accused of murder based on the revenge killing of the natives of Malalo Island. All of this resulted in a general court-martial of Wilkes. Wilkes was acquitted by the court, but the testimony tarnished his image and brought into question the validity of Wilkes' discoveries, especially his claims of the Antarctic continent. Wilkes remained in the Navy and eventually rose to the rank of Rear Admiral, serving admirably for the Union in the U.S. Civil War. But it would be nearly 100 years before Wilkes' discoveries were fully acknowledged and the expedition was given its due credit. While few people today even know of the incredible voyage of the United States exploring expedition, it was a voyage of discovery that remapped the world and changed it forever.